welcome to our Biz Huddle podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Cuthbert, Creative Director at Baker Creative. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please hit subscribe so you can get notified when new content comes out. Please share this with anyone who could be inspired by it. Hi, Michelle. Thanks so much for joining us on our podcast. We're really excited to have you.
Thanks for having me, and I'm sure no one will be confused by us both being named Michelle.
So tell everyone, what you do.
So I am Michelle, but I also go by Mace, which is my call sign. I spent 13 years on active duty as a fighter pilot in the Air Force, 3 of those flying for the Air Force Thunderbirds, and now I'm a speaker and an author.
Share with people how you got into the career that you have now.
I took a little bit of a roundabout path. So especially because I ended up flying for an air demonstration squadron, the Thunderbirds, doing these air shows, people often assume that I had, growing up in that environment, saw jets fly when I was a little girl and was like, I want to do that. It's a little bit different than that. I grew up in a small town in northern Wisconsin and not a military or an aviation family. So I just didn't have exposure to that world, and I really just didn't know it existed. But as I needed a way to pay for college, as I got into like junior, senior year of high school, I had really good grades, but my parents did not have a college fund for me. So my dad pulled me aside and was like, hey, let's consider scholarship options. I think you would do really well in the military. And my initial reaction was, I don't want to do that. I want to be a normal college kid. I have this, idea as a 17-year-old what that looks like. And when he was in college, he had seen ROTC cadets running around campus in their uniforms. And he was like, I think you would do well in that environment. There's also great scholarships through them. Let's at least consider it. So that kind of started the conversation. After looking at different options, the Air Force rose to the top. I didn't know then that I wanted to be a pilot, but just the idea of aviation seemed exciting and thrilling to me. I was really driven, thrill-seeking kid, loved roller coasters, loved travel. And the Air Force just seemed like it would fit the bill the best for that. So applied for an Air Force scholarship, got one, went off to college on that as a criminal justice major because I thought at that time I was going to do 4 years in the Air Force, get out, and I wanted to apply to be an FBI agent. That was my end goal. But fast forward a little bit, partway through college, I got to visit an Air Force base with my ROTC detachment, C-2 fighter jets taking off in full afterburner, up close, at dusk, with the orange flame coming out the back. And I was just like, holy crap, I want to go do that. Like, forget the FBI. How do I go do that? And that was kind of the moment of inspiration. And then I just had to decide to throw my name in the hat to compete for a pilot slot. And a lot had to happen between deciding I wanted to become a fighter pilot and actually making it happen. But we did it. And that was how it all started.
Wow. So tell us about, in a brief way, what was it like to even get to that point to get into the squad? I mean, I know it's quite a thing.
So there's kind of like 2 big pinch points. You get to Air Force pilot training, which is fairly competitive to get to that spot in the first place. But then you go into this year-long program where you are competing with your classmates to get class ranking, which will ultimately determine what aircraft you go into at the end of the training program. And I went in with the goal of not just being an Air Force pilot, but being a fighter pilot. Classes around that time were 25 students, which was how big mine was. And each class was getting anywhere from 1 to 3 fighter aircraft available. So the odds are not in your favor. And you know that. And everyone that you're working with who are also your best friends during that time are competing against you at the same time, because a lot of you have the same goals and there's just not enough spots to go around. So I ended up being the guy that was first in my class. Was clearly first. He just killed the program, did so well. So we knew if there was only one fighter, he was going to get it. I ended up coming in second, and we had a second spot, and that was all we had, were 2 for my whole class. And I had put F-16s, which is the type of fighter jet that I went on to fly, and that was my first choice. Ended up getting it. And that was just like a surreal moment because the odds are so not in your favor, made it happen, but then you actually get into the job and realize that now the work really starts
Mhm.
because it is a challenging airframe, a challenging career. So there was a lot of points in my career of being super goal oriented, working really hard towards one thing, achieving it, and then immediately having to be a beginner again. And the standards were constantly going up as I moved through all of these wickets. So that's to even just become a fighter pilot, much less the Thunderbirds, which is a whole nother process.
And I think that's very relevant because I think a lot of people feel like they're reinventing themselves, but not really seeing the big picture that they might be in the next level.
Yep.
When you're in it, you're like, oh my God, I got to start all over again.
Yeah.
But you weren't where you were 10 years ago. And I
Right.
think reminding yourself of that. Was there anything surprising for you that you were like, didn't what you didn't expect or?
So many things. I think that thrill seeking tendency, that love for roller coasters, the wanting to fly upside down and travel all over the world, that's what drew me to that career. Once I got there, though, I discovered it's so technical. Like it's all about gigahertz and bandwidth and like targeting ranges and like physics as far as flights times of weapons and geometry, and like it is very complicated.
Mm.
And not that I didn't have the capacity to learn that stuff, but I was also still a criminal justice major, right? So I was starting at square one with building that knowledge base. Some of my peers had been aeronautical engineers or mechanical engineers, and they had a better understanding of some of the basic concepts than I did. So I felt like there was a little bit of catch up initially, until you get to the knowledge level where now you're getting into the finer details that everyone has to learn. So that was surprising at first and kind of discouraging, honestly, because I had done really well at everything up until that point. And then I got there and I was like, oh, this is going to take years to get good at. This is not something that I just have a few months of learning and I'm going to know what I'm doing. Um, and then I think, myself included, there's a stereotype around fighter pilots and around that job that it's like this sexy, glamorous career. And I think, pop culture, Top Gun especially, has really created that kind of persona. It is not like it's long hours, it is tough conditions, it is in a tiny cockpit for 10 hours flying across the ocean trying to figure out how you're going to go to the bathroom, where you're going to put that, where you're going to put your snacks, how to not mix the two. Like there's just stuff it's so ridiculous it's funny at times, and the
Yeah.
only thing you can do is laugh about it because it just becomes normal to you. There is a whole lot that we in with the Thunderbirds as well, where you are this public figure and it's seen as kind of glamorous. There is a lot of stuff behind the scenes that is not that way at all.
I understand that. I do think Top Gun has definitely made that romance of the whole thing,
Yes,
right?
it's romanticized.
Yes. So then being in that kind of career, were there other women, female fighter pilots in the same crew, or were you the only one, or?
So there are various points I was either the only one or one of two. So in that pilot training class of 25 students, I was the only woman in my whole class. As I got to F-16 training and into my first F-16 squadron, there was one other woman, the same one that was in my course and then went to the same first base as I did, and we were really good friends. So that was really nice to have that
Mhm.
camaraderie. The unit I went to after that, not only was I the only female pilot for the 3 years that I was there, but I was the first female pilot the squadron had ever had in their entire history.
Wow, congratulations.
So, which was a little shocking to me. And I was a little bit worried about how I'd be received walking into this unit that had just, they never had to filter what they did or said, or, like it's just a little bit different. But they were awesome to work with and I was really welcomed there. So it ended up being amazing. But I had a little bit of apprehension when I found out I was going to be the first. And then just with the Thunderbirds, even, I was the fifth woman to fly for the Thunderbirds in the team's history. But
Mm.
the team had been around since 1953. And I got hired in 2019 was my first season. So there just had not been many of us. And for the 3 years that I flew with that unit, I was again the only female pilot the entire time I was there. So often the only one, occasionally one of two, but at the time I joined the Air Force, only about 2% of fighter pilots were female. Now it's up to about 4%. So progress is slow, but it's happening.
Being a trailblazer in this whole thing, what, what was your take on the whole thing? I mean,
My opinion around gender's role in my career evolved over time. When I was brand new and just really excited about chasing this big goal, I honestly didn't even really think about it. It
mhm,
was just irrelevant to me. I was like, this is what I want to do. Here are the standards. Here's the scale we're graded on. Here are the flights and the skills we have to demonstrate. Like, it doesn't matter what your gender is. As I got into the more competitive parts, like towards the very end of pilot training or getting into the F-16, it started to get highlighted to me more and more how unusual it was to be a woman in that role.
mhm,
So I started to feel the spotlight effect. And, as I got to my first combat squadron in the F-16, it was something that I think caused me to really struggle, not because of a lack of skills or aptitude to learn, but because I put so much pressure on myself and I felt this added responsibility that it felt like everyone was watching me, not necessarily hoping I would fail, but just waiting to see what would happen.
mhm,
And if I succeeded and did well, now I've created a positive stereotype for female fighter pilots and for any woman that's going to follow behind me. Like, women are great at this career. If I do poorly, now I've created the opposite. Now, because Mace didn't do well at air to air or air to ground or whatever skill in the cockpit it was, women are just not as good at that skill in the jet. And so that's a lot of pressure to carry. And then you
mhm,
add on top of that, the squadrons are just not used to having females in the room all the time. So when someone would say something that was, supposed to be funny, but it was borderline inappropriate or not even borderline sometimes,
mhm,
everyone would be like, "Oh," conversation would stop, every head would look at you, and I felt the weight of it was up to me to decide based on my reaction to what they just said whether that was appropriate or not. And I'm, 24 years old, 25 years old at this point. I'm one of the youngest, least experienced people in the unit. I'm just trying to prove myself. And it feels just like this extra responsibility is constantly being placed on me. I don't think intentionally by anyone, but I was
mhm.
just hyper aware of it.
So how did you work past that? I mean, I think that spotlight effect is big.
It is. And I think so many people experience it. And it's just a core recipe for imposter syndrome.
Mhm,
And I know that phenomenon tends to get tied to women. I don't think just women experience it,
mhm,
but I think when you find yourself being an extreme minority in an environment, the odds of you feeling like you have to overcompensate and prove yourself at such a higher level, and that if you have any, missteps or mistakes where you start to question that you might not be the one that should be there, that you might not belong there, the odds of that happening are just a lot greater when you're one of only a few people that look like you. And women tend to find themselves in that situation, in these
mhm,
types of careers. And so I think I took a normal level of learning and a normal level of self-doubt that comes with being a beginner in a difficult career field, and I blew it into something way bigger than it needed to be, and like got this almost crippling imposter syndrome. And it took me, I mean, that whole first assignment, 3 years, I struggled with that. And I think a couple of things like helped me dig out of that. One was just building my competence in the aircraft, right? Like getting good at the job.
mhm,
The respect came with that, the opportunities came with that. And I started to build a track record that I could look back on myself and be like, oh, I successfully became an instructor pilot. I deployed, I did this and this and this. And that is really what builds confidence, is struggling and failing and persevering and learning and getting better. And that just takes some time. And so when women ask me for advice, they're like, if you could give a young woman who's wants to be a pilot, for example, some advice, I always say that focus on getting really good at what you do. Focus on knowing your stuff, on your skill set, and all of if you have doubters or people that are, speaking out about whether or not you should be in that role, that stuff kind of just fades to the side when you just show that you're really good at what you do. And another part was, I mean, that first assignment, I spent a lot of time auditing how I showed up at work. Like I felt like I was playing dress up. I had my personality at home, just what I was naturally like, which was a little bit more shy, a little bit more introverted. And then I'm in this environment that at surface value seems to value type A, assertiveness, people who are outspoken, overly confident, and also values a certain type of humor. And so I wanted to fly under the radar, not stick out, be one of the guys, fit in as much as possible, while also performing at an extreme level to prove that I deserve to be there, which those two things are not necessarily very compatible with one another. So I felt like I was playing dress up all the time. How I reacted to a joke, what I would say, how I would speak in a brief or a debrief around a flight, how I would speak on the radio as far as how it sounded confidence wise. I'm overthinking all of those things because I feel like there's a big judgment happening for everything that comes out of my mouth or every action that I take. Fast forward 3 years later, I kind of just reached a point where I just couldn't do that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's just really not sustainable. And I got to a point where, I mean, this sounds cliche, but I was honestly just like, screw it. I'm like, they can take it or leave it. I'm just going to start being myself. When someone says something that I think is stupid and inappropriate, I'm not going to laugh at it. When I'm not interested in the topic they're talking about, I'm just going to be like, yeah, I don't know anything about that. I don't care about sports or I don't care about football. I'm not going to pretend. I'm just going to start to be me. And that felt really scary. And it felt like there was a lot of risk. But it turns out I made the best friends in that squadron who were all guys who also didn't think that those jokes were funny or who also wanted to go hiking instead of watch football when we were on the road or whatever it was. And so I built closer relationships. I was less exhausted because I didn't have to overthink everything I said and did. And my performance actually improved in my roles in the squadron, in the aircraft itself. Everything got better when I decided to just start showing up authentically and stop just over focusing on censoring everything that I did.
Well, and it sells yourself short, right? I mean, there's so much of you to give, and to fit into a box that maybe wasn't really designed for you.
And you
You know?
think of, and that seems so obvious, right? Like you think about if we all just edited ourselves to fit in these perfect labels, like
Mhm.
growth and innovation and new discoveries and new ideas would never happen.
True.
So it seems obvious when we talk about it, but I think when you're in that environment, that pressure to conform is so strong.
It's so true. It is so true because it's like you have to be perfect always.
Yep.
And you can't do it. It's just not possible.
Right.
Yeah. And being authentic, you have to be you. I mean, I think that's your strength, is just being who you are.
And that's one of the things I talk about a lot now with people is I think we can all identify those moments where, our what we value and what our real goals are, there when there's a disconnect between those and our actions and our words. And you kind of get that like cringy, icky feeling when you know that, oh, I should probably be speaking up against this thing that I'm kind of just conforming with because I believe this and I'm not, what I'm saying and doing is not reflecting that, or vice versa. And I think regardless of the role that you're in, whether you're male or female, like we all have those moments, and paying attention to them and
Mhm.
figuring out how we can more often align our actions and our words with our values is something that is worth taking the time to do.
So I know you guys have a lot of engagement with the crowds, and
Yep.
before you go and you travel, how did you feel about all that? Because that's a lot of overwhelm right
Yes.
there.
Uh, it was a lot. Um, there's so much I have to say about that. So, the reason I wanted to be a Thunderbird because I wanted to inspire girls and women.
Mhm.
And I saw that there wasn't a lot of representation happening in that role. And the flying was really fun, really challenging at first, but really fun. We got to do the coolest flying that I've ever done in my career. Like it's just crazy the stuff that you get to do in the jet in that role. But honestly, my favorite part of the job were those interactions I got to have where I could see a little girl after an air show comes up to the autograph line and her mom or her dad brings her up there and is like, look, she just flew that jet you watched do that thing that you were just in awe of. And when those dots connect for that kid and their eyes get big and like they light up, and you can see this 6-year-old little girl suddenly sees what's possible for her in the world as big, like there's more options all of a sudden. Like you just expanded the possibility for that person.
Mhm.
That was the coolest thing I got to do. And that's why I eventually left and became a speaker and an author. But I also, like I kind of mentioned, I'm a little bit more reserved, really shy and awkward as a kid. I kind of was able to outgrow that, but I still feel like I'm introverted and I need my time alone to recharge. Like that's where my energy comes from, is the moments I get to step back and be like, okay, I'm just going to go for a run, or I'm just going to sit in my room for a minute. I like being around people and interacting with them when I'm doing it, but I also feel like it's draining. And one of the hardest things, especially I would say the first half of my time with the Thunderbirds, was figuring out where I needed to create boundaries so
Mhm.
that I could be on when I needed to be, but I could also recharge, because I wasn't doing that at first. And I would find myself in situations where I just did not want to talk to the person that was in front of me. And I would have to remind myself that that might be the single interaction that they ever get to have with someone in my role. It's like being Cinderella at Disney World. If you have a stomach ache, no one cares. Like you have to be on, you have to be smiling, you have to be friendly. And that's a lot of pressure to do that. You know, we were on the road 240 days out of the year, and I did that for 3 years. And for better or worse, as the only female pilot, you end up with a lot of extra attention. There's always a longer line of people waiting to talk to you. There's always people stopping you in the hallway or in the bathroom or at the hotel or in the middle of your workout, or like it's just nonstop. And I never want to discount the good that came from those interactions, but I also don't want to pretend it was not hard.
Yeah. You felt like your space really wasn't your space.
Right. And so I would get kind of like cranky or grumpy at points where I'm just like, I just need a moment. Like, I just need one moment. Please just leave me alone for a second. And you can't say that to the people. So you have to find ways for your teammates to understand your strengths
Mhm.
and weaknesses and help you do that. And I had to, I don't know, give myself a little bit of grace that I had to take those moments and not, because I did struggle with feeling like I might not be the right person for the job again, that I wasn't going to be the perfect Thunderbird because I couldn't constantly just be on and engaging and happy and interactive, and I needed those little quiet moments. And ideally I wouldn't need that because the schedule's not built for it. So just being kind to myself and being like, okay, you're doing so many amazing things in this role, there is no such thing as doing it perfectly. And creating those boundaries was just so huge.
So, is there any part of it that you miss?
I don't miss the flying, which is really shocking to people, especially aviation enthusiasts, because it is a dream role to be in. Very hard on your body.
Mm.
The G's, the compression of gravity, like 9 times the force of gravity, was dealing with a lot of neck and back, especially back pain, pretty much chronically. I still deal with it because of that. So
Mm.
it eventually became a thing. I was like, okay, I've done this for 13 years. I think it's time to not do it anymore. Like there's my health and being pain free and all of that are more important. Um, but those interactions with kids, I don't get to
Mhm.
have those as often now because I primarily speak to corporate audiences. But occasionally, a few times a year, I will. And really, just 2 weeks ago, I got to go speak at an event at the Naval Aviation Museum of all places, Blue Angel territory, actually in Pensacola. A girls in aviation event that they had to over 400 girls that day. I got to read my children's book, which I have a couple children's books about a little girl that wants to be a pilot. I got to sign autographs and take photos and interact with all of these kids. And that was a reminder of how much I love doing that. And I don't get to do it often now, but that's probably the one thing that I would say I miss.
So, you've had this great career and you had an identity of a pilot, and now that you're out of it,
Yep.
was there a kind of a disconnect when that identity or your role was so drastically changed, even though that was something you wanted?
So I know for so many veterans, there is this feeling of loss and like loss of sense of purpose and identity when you leave. I think I was in a very fortunate situation because by my third year on the Thunderbirds, I had really felt like my purpose and my identity had shifted from being a pilot to inspiring other people. And that was honestly the main reason that I decided to leave the Air Force, because I didn't feel like I would be able to do that at the biggest capacity that I could if I stayed in the aircraft and I stayed in that role. I felt like there was another way that I could do that on a broader scale and have more of an impact. And because I felt like I had such a clear purpose and a clear path to do it, that has just been my focus. And we're about 2.5 years into doing this. And I haven't felt like this huge sense of loss or loss of identity. I think the big thing that I did lose was my community.
Oh,
I
that-
instantly had people that just spoke the same language, had the same jokes, had all these shared common experiences. No matter what unit I was in, you just find the closest friends. And now I go to being a solo entrepreneur where I work from my home office when I'm not on the road. And when I'm on the road speaking, I show up, I meet the team. I might have dinner with a few people that I've never met before. And then I go give a keynote and I have great interactions with people afterwards where they come up and talk about it being inspiring and impactful and what they're going to do with it. And those are really rewarding, but then they're done. And now I'm back at the airport, back at the hotel by myself, traveling alone on to the next place. So there's a lot of very fleeting interactions with people and not a lot of depth as far as developing close relationships. And so I think that has been the hardest thing, is really just the loss of community.
I totally can relate to that. I mean, it's so true. When you're the boss, you have to know all the answers. And it feels lonely. Even if you're, a solopreneur or you have a bunch of people that work for you, you have to feel like you're perfect. Everyone's looking at you. You have to have all the answers the right time, always with clients. There's a lot of similarities between your experience as a fighter pilot and now you're the entrepreneur. Is there any advice you would give to our entrepreneurs out there right now?
I think one of the things I've learned over the last couple of years sharing my story and really speaking on self-doubt and imposter syndrome and fear of failure and kind of these things that are unexpected based on my background is just how normal it is. You know, I knew my message would resonate with women in male-dominated career fields. I knew it would probably resonate with people that are really entry level and really challenging jobs. A lot of doctors and lawyers are like, "Oh my gosh, I feel all the same things." We work super hard to get through med school and then we get to the job and we have no idea what we're doing and it's just learning for years afterwards, which is how it felt for me. What has surprised me is the number of leaders that come up, the number of people that have a corner office, have a big title after their name, have decades of experience, and both women and men who will come up to me after a keynote where I'm very vulnerable and they're like, "I have felt that way my entire career. I have not felt ready for a single position I've moved into. I've always felt like there might be someone that's better for the job. I've always felt like everyone's looking to me and I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just figuring it out as I go." And I think there's so much power in just gaining that perspective and just normalizing it as a human feeling, because now we go from, "Oh, I feel this way. Maybe that means I'm not right for this and I'm not qualified," to, "Oh, I feel this way. This is normal because I'm learning and I'm growing and I'm a beginner." And that
Mhm.
distinction changes everything.
It does. It totally shifts because then you don't feel alone. And I
Right.
think that's a wonderful gift that you could leave after a keynote or any of that, that people can relate to you to the point they can share that. Speaks to you how you speak.
I think the most common piece of feedback I get after speaking is that was so surprisingly relatable, because I think we get put on a pedestal. Being a Thunderbird pilot, they're like, "Oh, it's like being Batman." Like there's people like her, like them that do that, and there's people like me that have fear and doubt. And I get up there and I talk about all of those things and I frame it around how that fit into my journey of doing what I did, and it just normalizes their big goals and big dreams as something that's actually possible, not some crazy rainbows and unicorns alternate universe where thing like a thing that other people go do. Now it's like, "Oh, this is a thing I could go do."
Did you ever feel like when you're in the plane that you were like, had a moment where you're just like, what am I doing here? Or did you always felt like I just not going to think about it and just move past it?
In the jet itself, I think I was really good at compartmentalizing any of those types of thoughts. I would just be very mission and task focused. So it would just always be, all right, where am I headed? What's the next thing? What should my airspeed be at this moment? What should I be saying on the radio? There's just so much happening that you can forget about all that kind of stuff because you're just like, what do I do next? There's no room to think about those things. After you land, and then especially after you go and do a debrief where we all go in a room and we look through the entire flight and we analyze every little thing that went wrong. Everyone fesses up to any mistakes that they made. The fighter squadrons create that environment so that we can improve quickly and so that everyone can get better as a team. And there's so much like wealth of knowledge and so many lessons that can come from that culture. But you also walk away from that having talked about all the things you just did wrong. And so, especially when you're just getting used to being in that environment all the time, there's a lot of moments where that doubt starts to creep in after the fact.
Now that you're the entrepreneur, what kind of common mistakes do you typically see others doing?
I think, and this is something I've struggled with as well, a lack of structure and lack of putting like a process and a system in place and ending up feeling like you just constantly have to be busy because as long as you're working on something, then you don't feel like guilty that you're taking a break. But a lot of times we're busy just to be busy. And you find yourself in just this constant task shifting of email and LinkedIn and social media and a phone call, a contract, and you never really get to work on the things that brought you to that place in the first place. Like even with me and speaking being the heart of my business and that storytelling being the thing that really drew me to doing this, the amount of time I spend on all of those other things I just mentioned versus figuring out how to make my speech better, how to impact the audience more, how to tell the story in a better way. I often realize that I lose sight of that at times when I just feel like I'm just busy to be busy with all these little tiny tasks. So putting some structure in place to prioritize what you, with your unique strengths, like how you can move the needle the most, and then taking those other things that someone else might be able to do. Like there's so many good virtual assistants that you can get now at all different price points. Being okay handing some of that off to someone else and trusting that, sure, they might not execute it exactly the same that you would, but they'll probably have an 80% solution and that might be good enough because it allows you to focus on what really matters.
Agreed. Totally agreed. So when it's all said and done, what kind of legacy would you like to leave?
I think my legacy will be in the people that I help push to go do big things. Like I don't want my tombstone someday to say Air Force Thunderbird pilot. You know what I mean? Like I want it to at my eulogy or whatever to talk about all the people that I've impacted, not all the cool things that I've done. And it's been a lot of work to bridge that gap. And there's been a little bit of being okay that not everyone will understand what I'm doing right now. And just focusing on the impact it has on other people, because that's what really matters.
In your books, what would you like to happen with your books that you've done?
Yeah, so my children's books, which you can see behind me, Upside Down Dreams and What's Your Call Sign, the reason that I wrote those was just seeing that there weren't a ton of children's books with little girl protagonists that other kids could relate to around aviation. There were some aviation kids books with female protagonists, but it was generally Amelia Earhart, which had, incredible story, but not the most relatable, just based on the amount of time that has passed. And I wanted a book that, a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old opens and they see themselves in. And so Lily Padilli is the character. She's in both books. She's an 8-year-old who wants to be a fighter pilot. And those books are really a passion project, but they are one of the things that brings me the most joy and reward in all the stuff that I do, because kids at that age, much like those kids that came up in the autograph line, they just don't know what they don't know. And if they never see it and they never see it with someone they can see themselves in, it doesn't even occur to them that it's something that they could potentially even want to do. And so that's kind of one of my main missions, is to just open the eyes to girls and women so that they know it's an option and they know it's something they're capable of and something they would be welcomed in. And if they don't want to do it, that's totally fine. But I just want them to know that it's an option.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story. I think a lot of people will learn a lot.
I think it's just so relatable, right? Like, we could talk about fast jets and flying formation and get into the nitty-gritty, like cool high performance airplanes. But I think the bigger impact is just being a human and sharing a human message that no matter what you're struggling with or what your views are on the world, that you can find yourself in. So thanks for letting me share it, and thanks for letting me have the time.
If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please hit subscribe so you can get notified when new content comes out. Please share this with anyone who could be inspired by it, and feel free to post any questions so we can be inspired by new content. Thanks for listening. If you're interested in learning more, visit our website at bakercreative.co.